For the last 5 months, I have been playing Space Age, Factorio's largest update ever, every week with 4 to 10 other players on a weekly basis. After 103 hours, we beat the game while I built up quite a bit of thoughts about our experience. Spoilers, I enjoyed the vast majority of it and can confidently report that the majority of our group were excited to play each week, sharing mechanics they particularly enjoyed or some abomination they plan to build next. However, nothing is perfect, and I'll be covering aspects that I found awkward, clunky, or otherwise think could be improved when they come up. I also previously completed the similarly titled Space Exploration plus Factorio 2 in Factorio 1.0, which took me nearly 550 hours, and given how similar the concepts between the two games are, comparisons between the two will naturally pop up. You can think of Space Exploration as the Kaizo Dark Souls version of Space Age, an order of magnitude more complex, difficult, and grindy. This video is split up into chapters by subject if that's your thing, so you can click on the bar below and go to where you think something is interesting if you want to. But let's back up a second. Yes, this was a multiplayer playthrough. Despite top-notch multiplayer features and stability, you may not even know that Factorio has a multiplayer mode. This is because a majority of content creators focus on the single-player mode of the game, and for good reason. It's a very complicated game requiring a degree of forethought and perfectionism to beat in any sane amount of time. Coming up with your own factory designs can be difficult enough when you're on your own, and when you're in a group, it's like 5 people trying to build a skyscraper in the same place with 5 different designs. In fact, Factorio is one of the few games that I would argue is harder with more people. Concepts that are easy to understand can be surprisingly difficult to communicate, and in my experience, agreement on these issues is rare. But there are some obvious benefits too. More people means we can work on different things in parallel. In theory, if your thing makes iron plates and I don't care how it makes iron plates, I can make something that uses the iron plates and just assume the iron plates part of the problem is taken care of. In practice, I sometimes end up with somebody making a single furnace making iron, and yes, congratulations, you are technically making iron, but my setup assumed there would be something like 50 furnaces making iron. For our group, this is due in part to differences in experience with Factorio. You play this game long enough and you'll start to see every process is just a thing making a thing with things, and you might as well make a scalable factory making 10 of the thing, but can be expanded to make 1,000,000 of the thing if you need to. Thing. The tenure of the group I played with varied widely, from me having 1,200 hours in the game going in to another person with a respectable 100 hours, all the way down to people who have never opened the game before. If you thought explaining your hexagon tile bot only reversible carb-free city block design was difficult, imagine explaining it to someone who doesn't know what an inserter is. Going into the game, I already had a predestined design in mind because I was terrified of getting stuck in the mud with ultra spaghetti and endless debates about the usage of space. I went so far as to write out a document outlining loose rules of which I spelled out using a train city block design because it would allow freedom of people doing whatever they want in clearly defined and independent space. If you don't know what a train city block design is, that's okay, just think about a train driving in a square and you're 90% there. Spoilers, we didn't even get that complicated and just made the tried and true main belt. Yes, I say main belt and not main bus because when I say main belt, there is no confusion about what I'm talking about versus bus, which is more general and could technically refer to a bus of trains, and in that case, we have to caveat the phrase with belt main bus in that situation, which sounds stupid and is less efficient, and no, just because you watched a video where somebody called it a main bus doesn't mean that you can parade around and tell people they have to call it that. I actually don't care what you call it, I'm just addressing the commenters who comment this way and attempt to expand their mind to the actual goal of language, which is to efficiently transmit information, not dogmatically force people to talk the same way you do. Anyway, if you ranked every member in the group on the amount of things built on Navis, I think the order would be similar to the amount of experience everyone had going in. This isn't terribly surprising, but going into the whole thing, I didn't really factor in that there were people who understood what go make an iron mine means off the bat and those who didn't. I wasn't aiming for a perfectly even distribution of work across all individuals, but I did try to facilitate help when I could. I think an important factor is to include everyone and allow everyone the opportunity to make and feel their contribution to the factory. On the flip side, I didn't want to tell anybody what to do. I wouldn't find that fun, I don't think it would work well. But in retrospect, several people in the group probably would have preferred it that way. If I had a grand vision of this train system going in, then I might as well become full dictator and start calling the shots. But on the other hand, there were also people who would have totally hated this. They had their own vision of what to do, and no matter how much autonomy they were granted, doing what I say wouldn't be fun. I want to underscore this dynamic because in most games, this doesn't matter at all. In Minecraft, for example, everyone can generally just go off and do random things, and you don't really run into many issues aside from don't blow up the cave or tree that we decided to make our base in and everything goes fine. In fact, most games facilitate this ease of adoption, and Factorio is the odd one out, requiring, in my opinion, coordination between all systems in order to make meaningful progress. But the rules document I drafted wasn't a total flop. In fact, I'm very glad I made it. It added an important structural component for the group to lean on, especially for those that appreciate it, and had a few key elements. First, I strongly suggested everyone be there day one. In a game like Factorio, if you show up to a game and things are already half built, it's hard to feel like you're really part of the game. Additionally, onboarding to all of the systems that have been made already can feel like doing homework when what you wanted to do was, play a game. I also hashed out a few more things and briefly went through them with the group on day one. First, polling people for the day of the week that most people were free, and then playing the game at the same time on that day each week. The second thing was don't do bad things, and I wasn't as worried about this because I know the people I was playing with pretty well, but if somehow this did pop up, I could at least say, hey, please stop, with some legislative authority. Setting up multiple voice channels was something I also did in the Discord in case people wanted to deep dive on certain features and not be interrupted by the larger group, given that we'd have upwards of 9 people in the main channel at the same time. I also hashed out the aforementioned city block designed once trains were unlocked and said that we were going to go ahead with that. And finally, when we get to space, it is a new jurisdiction and you are free from the bureaucracy of rules and your manifest destiny determined by your capabilities in space. And then, the spiciest rule of all, at any time, anyone can initiate a vote to execute somebody, and if they get a supermajority, which typically was everybody -2, then that player who was voted to be executed will be executed. This rule was by far the most consequential and requires its own deep dive, but first let's cross off all the rules that were never followed and could have been left out altogether. Yeah, most of them. In a strange way, these rules may have still been beneficial though for those who appreciate structure and a steady guiding hand as we venture toward engineering a complicated factory in a chaotic multiplayer environment. According to my estimation, roughly half the group had this order-loving trait, which means logically the other half spans the polar opposite side of reveling in independence, freedom, and chaos. This isn't a good or bad thing, it's just an individual difference and means that you bring different things to the table. In fact, if I wasn't in charge of the whole thing, I would solidly fall into the independence, freedom, chaos side myself. But us chaos lovers don't need rules, we see them as obstacles and begin to dream of rebellion. I was conscious of this at the drafting of the Constitution, and despite not using a majority of the rules laid out, I was being conservative with the rules and had many more in mind. Specifically, I avoided explicitly telling people what to do as much as I could, favoring a to-do list system that people could use for inspiration and elect to do themselves. Paradoxically, I slowly realized that some of these organization-loving individuals would actually have preferred and even thrived if I had explicitly commanded them to do things. With these polar differences in the group, I am pretty happy with the way that everything turned out though. Everything, except that execution rule I mentioned. As I mentioned before, anybody may call a vote to have another player executed with a supermajority, and there's a few reasons why I wanted to have this rule. First, people are inevitably going to do things that may be incompatible with things that other players want to do, and I didn't want to dictate the rules of behavior myself. I wanted them to emerge naturally from democratic voting to find what the preferences of the group are and what constitutes something that should be executionable and not. Execution works well because there is close to zero consequence for dying in Factorio. You can just run and grab your stuff after you died and you're back to 100%, but this is still hopefully enough of a nudge to enforce cooperation and respecting others. And finally, And most important of all, executing each other is hilarious. There were actually quite a few moments that emerged as a result of this rule that had me and the entire group laughing out loud and behaving in this quasi-emergent government that was beginning to form. But there were also a few emergent problems that I didn't foresee. First, I communicated the rules of the execution system, but not the intention. If people knew that it was supposed to help with disputes and not suspect it was a vehicle for my own corrupt ambitions as a leader, I think it would have gone smoother. The next issue was that there was no penalty for voting to execute somebody, so people can just willy-nilly continue voting, and if I could go back, I would make it so if you called a vote to execute and lost, that you yourself would be executed. In my eyes, nobody really abused the voting system, but I think this would have made things more fair, and also more people would have been executed, which would have been great. And finally, there is no requirement for a charge or explanation for what was done to cause a vote to continue. In a few cases, the person getting executed didn't actually know why they were being executed and thus couldn't change their behavior in the future to not be executed again, leading to natural frustration and demotivation. Adding a requirement for a charge would have given that necessary feedback to the perpetrator and also, again, reduced the suspicion around conspiracy and corruption within the system. As a whole, I also wanted to give the playthrough an enforcement mechanism of a particular settler Wild West vibe, and in a rough sense, it performed its duty, even if I would have made drastic changes if I tried it again. Which brings me to another aspect of group playthroughs: power dynamics. I have always been very sensitive to power in group situations. In my eyes, those who abuse their power are in the category of the most frustrating, immature, narcissistic, and outright unpleasant people you can encounter. In this case, I am the one who wields the majority of the power by the natural realities of both hosting the game and subjecting those who play with me to end up in YouTube videos. Not only can I theoretically dictate the pace of the game at every turn, I also possess the power of the press and ability to edit any interaction in whatever direction I choose. I even have hundreds, even thousands more hours in the game we are playing, so I fundamentally know how to do most things inside the game than anyone else. I have all the pieces to embody that despicable, power-hungry individual. I won't argue that I perfectly avoided the pitfalls of power, but by default I have these realities ever present in the back of my mind. At every turn I thought hard about how not to abuse it. In some sense this is even a false dilemma, as if I did inappropriately use power, everybody could just leave. There's nothing saying they need to play Factorio game with me, so from this perspective, it's not a preference but a requirement that I at least make attempts to protect everyone's freedom. This included not telling people what to do, being okay with other people's builds even if they were dog shit, and yes, there was some dog shit, there always is. I also wanted to get input from others if there was a fork in the road with research priorities or how we were going to build something, and this is where the paradox came up. At least for the early game on Navis, I may have been better off being a dictator. Now, that might sound ridiculous given everything I just said, but hear me out. I've played through the early game upwards of 20 times. I know the ins and outs of every material, how to scale production, how belts, trains, and bots are best used, how to increase throughput, which is not trivial for a beginner, mind you. Couple this with the fact that there is something glorious out there, all the space age stuff that nobody has experienced and therefore is the most exciting, and you could make an argument for taking total control, commanding everybody in the group, and speedrunning the early game for the purpose of getting to space and then granting everyone freedom. I believe this would have been fairly demotivating and caused people to check out fairly quickly, but I didn't actually do it, and you could make the case for doing it, especially if your group is much different from mine. In fact, this speedrun sort of did happen. The most experienced member of the crew, aka Waz, and I essentially blitzed out a main belt and built almost everything on Navis with little input from others, who focused more on mining and quote-unquote defense with an allergy to train systems, lest they be slapped on the wrist for a botched rail signal placement. So yeah, overall, we had a fairly chaotic, bloody, tumultuous time on Navis, but in doing so, the members of the crew had enough experience to really blossom in the space age part of the game, which was simply awesome and totally worth it. Although our group shrunk from 8 or 9 to 5 or 6 by the time we launched to space, the space age experience was an exceptional payoff to the early game. Just a quick note, these individuals didn't necessarily leave because they were bored, they mostly had other obligations that popped up, such as the way of big group gaming. Anyway, the building of the first platform was utterly exciting. I had been drooling at the mouth ever since the launch of the space platform video from Woob as a teaser. Ever since then, I wanted a massive asteroid shooting, space rock grabbing, mineral processing pile of garbage flying through space, and that is more or less exactly what I was able to build. I took the lead on creating the first platform, while the rest of the group focused on providing me space platform, building out rocket launching infrastructure, progressing scientific capabilities, and expanding out our borders for room to grow the factory and secure resource deposits. And we were finally functioning like a society with multiple shared goals and responsibilities, and it was awesome! Exactly what I was looking for. New content includes many things: art, animations, features, quality of life, gameplay, performance, music, and even more than that. Across the board, everything is improved, which is extra impressive for a game like Factorio that already hit such high marks on all of these categories before the update. And somehow they still blew it out of the park. The quality of life and new features alone would have been an amazing update. There were so many I can't even count, and almost all of them were amazing. Off the top of my head, we got the science per second graph, seeing other players highlighting objects, parameterized blueprints, train interrupts, and route groups, improved and specified emoticons to signal issues better, target prioritization for turrets, simplified fluid and pump mechanics, pump filtering, items searching in the map, improved bot behavior, theoretically, editing buildings while they're still in blueprints, an improved map view, selector combinators, and possibly my favorite, multiple conditions on decider combinators and highlighting of conditional statements that are true, which greatly simplifies certain builds and makes combinators much easier to learn. And this probably isn't even one half of the new features, and we're not including new content like space platforms and planets. It is not a stretch to say these features elevated the large group gaming experience to the very top. It felt like every 10 minutes somebody found a new feature that helped them get something done faster or communicate or discover something faster than they could have before. Absolutely amazing, and I loved playing with all the new features. The first new piece of actually new content we hit were these space platforms I've been talking about so much. They were super cool to work with and had a ton of flexibility and customization, allowing you to make the platform take on a modality of different functions. Our first platform didn't have thrusters, it just sat above Navis collecting materials only found in space like carbon and ice, assembled that into space science, and then transported it back down to another new building, the cargo landing pad on Navis. This first platform is a great way to introduce players to the mechanics. It's fairly simple to set up, requiring only space platform starter kits, some space platform, asteroid collectors, asteroid crushers, and a few inserters to be sent into space. At this point, you hardly even need belts. A lot of the early build can be directly inserted into the platform and then be sent back down to Navis. The later progression will see thrusters being attached, allowing for travel between planets and turrets to defend the planets from incoming asteroids that would otherwise damage it. These additions are great, but as the features get added to the platform, there's an unfortunate side effect of bogging down the experience. Asteroids come in 3 varieties, each of which randomly give one of 3 outputs when fully researched, for a total of 9 unique resources, and these need to be turned into fuel and ammunition for the platform to move at all. And trust me when I say handling a random assortment of resources coming out of one building takes up a lot more space and forethought than if you had a fixed set of resources coming out. With the inability to use chests in space, you can't just have the platform build up on a bunch of resources while docked at a planet. Well, you can, kind of, but not very well at the start. It needs to be self-sufficient on the fly, and this means a new platform can't just be easily spun up. You need to first take care of collecting, processing, the removal of excess resources that might block up all of the processing, or reprocessing of these resources, and routing all the resources to the different places that they need to be processed, and then also processing them, and then taking the processed resources and putting them where they need to go. Later in the game, making a boilerplate new platform can take over 2 hours, and it's not just that I'm slow or something. I did a scientific reading of at least n equals 2 Reddit posts that said the same thing, so it's true. In any case, if you asked me to make a new platform at the start of the game, I'm very excited, and if it were the end of the game, I'd feel like, I guess I'll eventually make it, but I'm not very excited. The sending of resources off the platform to the planets is really cool. A lot of time was spent on the animations and the feel of these rockets that slowly hover down to the hub, and the number of rockets you can receive that being linked to the number of cargo bays attached to the landing pad, which also increase its inventory size. It's all just a really cool system. But I have a few issues. First, you can't use the landing pad as a giant 9x9 chest. From a balance perspective, I know why. It's because a giant chest with a large surface area for many inserters to place into and out of would trivialize a lot of the gameplay around routing resources to make increasingly complex materials. But from a gameplay perspective, I just created a giant hub to land cargo into, and you're telling me that I didn't even give it the basic feature that a metal box has the ability for an inserter to put things into it? It just feels really clunky when you run into that fact, and I think it could really use some explanation for why. The other issue is that you can only place one of these landing pads per planet. Again, I understand the balance. If you could place a bunch of these down anywhere, it would make the manufacturing trivial, as you teleport infinite amounts of a majority of the basic materials down to a planet anywhere. But again, nothing explains why you can only have one hub. The game's just like, I don't know, I guess you're an engineer smart enough to make a rocket, but not smart enough to build two of the same building. Deal with it. Please just give me some reason for this malarkey. Also, the rockets that send down the materials are just free, which, yes, this simplifies the experience, but I wouldn't have minded a system that required me to build each one and be able to customize my payloads back down to the planets. In relation to space exploration, the mod that was inspired by and also inspired this expansion, the tackling of the space platform was handled very differently. While in most cases this is a good thing, as mechanics in space exploration are incredibly complicated, often requiring circuits to complete, one of the best things in space exploration is the handling of rockets and spaceships. In space exploration, the entire atmosphere above a planet is considered its own section of space, and space platform is just ground to build your space factory on instead of the spaceship itself. The early game sees you launching tons of rockets with many different things to build out this space, and you eventually can make spaceships that act like the space-age space platforms with thrusters, except they actually exist in relationship to the platform and take off and land independently of it taking up space, and even having the functionality of a moving factory, which was super cool. They were also required to be cone-shaped in order to reach top speeds, something space-age discards in favor for caring much more about width of a space platform for it to reach max speed. This is easier to learn, but it also means that all of your space platforms are just Wyoming instead of the pointed spaceships in space exploration that are much more fitting, in my opinion. What you lose out on with the new system is the experience of building a literal factory in space above a planet. While I think this was far too time-consuming to accomplish in space exploration, I built this, which was a truly amazing experience and something I feel is missed in Space Age. I know they aren't supposed to be the same thing, but this really did feel like one of the best aspects in space exploration, so to deviate from it so heavily is notable, and it will be missed. Another consequence is that Space Age platforms can't interact with one another. There aren't many use cases for this, but when it does come up, it feels like something you should be able to do, and what you have to do instead is send the items to the planet and then rocket them back up to the other platform, which just feels strange. One final thing, bots and electric poles aren't usable in space. Instead, things just build out of the platform and are automatically connected to whatever power you can generate on the platform. The animations for building are cool, and it's convenient to not need to use poles, but it further alienates the space platforms from the Factorio feel, which is hard to quantify, but it includes power poles, bots, and finite resources. With infinite resources, no poles, and no bots, it can be jarring starting out and trying to remember what you can and can't do on platforms. By the time you get to the end of Space Age, it starts to make sense why these changes were necessary in order to create the experience they worked toward. I understand why we didn't just get space exploration light, but something like this is interesting to note, as they are still incredibly similar concepts and have been symbiotically influencing one another for a long time. The majority of the rest of the new content happens on new planets, so I split them into their own section. I took the lead in landing at the first planet, the one I was most excited for, Fulgora. Most people land at Vulcanus first for good reason, but I had to go to Fulgora first. The freedom to choose is something I appreciated quite a lot. On the flip side, the space exploration process of choosing a planet to go to based on expected resources, distance to the sun, and biter threats is not present. The system was complicated, so I understand why planets with fixed biomes and resources were chosen, but choosing a planet based on an intense analysis and weighing features and drawbacks of planets was a huge part of what made space exploration rewarding, and so I leave this note here as it will be missed. Anyway, Fulgora is essentially a pile of trash where recycling and getting valuable stuff like processing units is very easy, but getting basic stuff like iron plates is much more difficult. It inverts the gameplay loop in a very interesting way that made my mind run wild with possibilities of exporting these easily made expensive materials while importing the easily made stuff. The trash is recycled in the building aptly named the Recycler, which was one of the more exciting buildings going into the playthrough, as it recycles each piece of scrap into one of 12 different resources, and my solution to the planet was treating it like 12 different buckets filling up in 12 different chests. To prevent the system from backing up, buckets that became full would empty a bit of their contents to use the second function of the Recycler, which is recycling any material into its component parts. This is the intended way of converting expensive things into basic things on planet, but also opens the door to upcycling with the new quality modules. Quality is also a new feature that allows anything to be built with a higher quality, improving various aspects such as the range of a gun, health of a wall, or speed of an inserter turning. Naturally, some things are better made in quality, but the feature is incredibly rich, taking us another 100 hours to fully understand and master. Although it can be very resource intensive and time consuming, especially at the start, later on it is incredibly rewarding to be using buildings that are higher quality and offer more efficient utility in so many domains. Fulgora's new resource is holmium, which allows the planet to make its signature goodies: recyclers, Tesla turrets, guns and ammo, mech armor, which is the best in the game, lightning rods that convert the natural lightning strikes on the planet into power, quality modules, electromagnetic facilities, which have a base 50% productivity increase to anything that they can create, which includes copper cables, all types of circuits, all types of modules, and of course, Fulgora's signature electromagnetic science. Unfortunately, as time goes on, it starts to become more and more of a hassle to deal with all the trash relative to just making whatever you need on other planets or even in space with quality buildings and better modules. So in the late game, we sort of only used it to produce all the things that are unique to Fulgora and forego the recycling gambling loop. But I spent a large chunk of the playthrough here building out all of those facilities and solving problems in new ways that the planet forces you to do, and it was a great experience overall. While I solved this planet on my own, two of the other members of the group were solving the next planet, Vulcanus. I spent close to 0% of my playthrough on Vulcanus, so I didn't have much direct knowledge of the place, but from what the team who landed on there reported, it appeared to be a fun time using lava to generate infinite copper, iron, and stone, using its signature building, the Forge, while being low on other more common resources on Navis like water and certain oil products. Solar is 3 times more effective, allowing for easy passive power generation, and you are limited in the space you can build on lest you anger a giant worm. These critters are incredibly resistant to lasers and explosives, requiring a staggering amount of damage to kill. The team generally had little problem killing them using uranium ammo in a cacophony of turrets though, which was a little sad, as I would have loved to see some love to some of the lesser used items like poison capsules or bot swarms, but they still weren't necessarily a pushover. Once killed, they will never respawn, and the land they once roamed is now yours to build on. With the free resources from the lava and ease of power generation with solar panels, Vulcanus makes for a great first planet to land on if you're new at the game especially. The new resources, tungsten and calcite, can both be mined, and there are no random outputs and few byproducts to deal with in recipes. It contains new and exciting aspects, but it's not so different from your Navis experience that your experience won't translate. It is the unique biome in which you can craft forges, which have built-in 50% productivity like electromagnetic facilities, turbo belts, which are even faster than blue belts, artillery and artillery shells, and the unique lava science, or whatever you call it on Vulcanus. I may be missing some things that are made on Vulcanus, but that really was the beauty of our playthrough. Harken back to the multiplayer section, my goal was to have freedom of exploring and solving planets for everybody. The fact that I became the Fulgora expert while others became the experts on their respective planets was a huge element of the run. I would announce to everyone that I had finally crafted mech armor, and for those on Vulcanus, they rejoiced because now they could finally fly over lava with impunity. Similarly, when Vulcanus began producing turbo belts, I was ecstatic that I could import some and increase the speed of my scrap sorting solution by something like 30%. As the planets co-developed, a new industry of space platforms built to transfer resources between planets and send resources from space that they may be missing to the on-planet cargo hubs emerged. One guy stayed back and honorably defended Navis while using the powerful main belt and newly researched and imported products to research ways of crafting relevant buildings with higher quality that we could then use on the space platforms. It was so cool! All the while, we could go upwards of 45 minutes at a time, silently working away at our current goal, saying nothing. This begs the question, are we still playing a multiplayer game or just several single-player games that are disjointed on the same server? But there was still plenty of coordination of finished products needed, and it seemed like every unique pair of players was engaged at one point or another. It was truly unique, and all the hard work on Navis brought us to this point. And then there's Gleba. Gleba is notorious for being bad. I've seen a lot of discussion about it, and most is quite negative. It's not necessarily Gleba's fault. It has a theme of everything can spoil if you don't use it in time, and if it does, you need to do something with the spoilage. The problem here is the whole everything thing. The end of every belt and every building needs to have an inserter that can trash the spoilage, that then needs to go onto a trash spoilage belt, and that can't be blocked up by excess spoilage. There's only a select few places you can farm the red and green stuff that are unique to Gleba, and the locals that defend the place are actively compelled by the farming, and they ignore walls, and they spawn more stuff, and you can't effectively deal with them until you can make rocket turrets, which you can only make on Gleba later. Everything also needs nutrients to work, which yes, they spoil too, and it means everything at the end of the day has n+1 inputs and n+1 outputs. The guy who went to Gleba and tried to do so from scratch, which don't do that unless you're making a video on it. It's just so slow and painful. When I was comfortable with where Fulgora was at, I took a ship over to Gleba and just started dropping everything I could onto the planet. I said, screw your sense of purity. I even made a wall of landmines financed by a ship was made specifically to harvest asteroids into landmines. The defense also included Tesla turrets from Fulgora, so all in all, it did have a really cool defense setup of landmines, Tesla turrets, and rocket turrets. Even the unique science, though, spoils, which is thematic and an interesting problem to solve, but Gleba's problems are therefore being exported to Navis like a virus. I came around to Gleba and started to appreciate that it had 100% self-sufficiency once it was completely set up, but getting there sucked. I think it had to do with a few things. First, everything needed nutrients, and outputting spoilage felt really grindy and unnecessary. The spoilage was time-based, which means that bulk manufacturing is complicated and punishing to figure out how much of everything you need, because it might spoil before you can make stuff, and you might not have enough to make stuff, so you need to really give somewhere in the ballpark of the right amount of stuff. And the third thing was the spoilage only had a handful of uses, so while it did feel kind of cool to recycle it as a free byproduct, it also seemed like you were piling up useless garbage. Contrast this with data card recycling in space exploration, which was one of the coolest things to set up. It is even more grindy and has the equivalent of 4 types of spoilage that each have different recycling requirements, but with no spoilage timer and the very valuable blank data cards that they could recycle into and then be fed back into the labs, gave this really powerful feeling of a living machine that cyclically crafts blank data cards as research data to them and then recycles them back into data cards to be fed back in. I would have loved some element of recycling the spoilage into something valuable instead of just nutrients that are probably going to spoil again. At the very least, the exports are really powerful. Stack inserters allow you to effectively quadruple the maximum throughput of belts by stacking multiple objects on the same conveyor belt tile. This is incredibly powerful for a multitude of problems and even has applications in allowing a space platform to quadruple the amount of raw materials it is storing on belts because, again, they can't use chests in space. Rocket turrets are great and even necessary early on to destroy big asteroids on the way to the last planet, and heating towers are great at generating power, but they can't be used in space, which consequently is the saddest thing. I severely wanted a coal-powered space platform. I'm actually still sad about this. Please, I needed just one small patch. That's all I need. Just at the bottom of the page of the patch notes, nobody will notice. I beg you, please just add the ability to burn stuff in space. I really want it. Nobody's gonna use it, please. Getting to Aquilo is the first real test of space voyages. It's about double the distance of a normal planet from Navis, has big asteroids that need missiles to shoot down, and even has a very low solar coefficient as it is far from the sun. You'll need nuclear power plants, rocket turrets, and the buildings necessary to create missiles fast enough to shoot down all the asteroids. Asteroid reprocessing is also necessary because the oxide asteroids don't contain metal needed to make fuel and ammo, so your ship really needs to be modern at this point, as oxide asteroids are the only asteroids above Aquilo. You can use forges in space now, as the oxide asteroids create calcite with advanced processing, and the process of making the ship do this was a mixed bag of exciting and daunting. In either case, once we sent a Brave Scout to Aquilo, we realized it had a fundamentally different setup than all the other planets. It's missing many basic resources, including copper, iron, and even stone, so a majority of the infrastructure needs to be imported. You're also confined to small islands, but can turn the natural ice into ice platforms to expand the building space. One last issue, every entity on the planet requires an adjacent heated pipe to work properly. This fundamentally changes what you can build on the surface and forces you to create your builds with extra space in mind. Although the space is highly restrictive in what you can do, it was also really fun figuring out how to work with these limitations. The reason its restrictions weren't annoying like Gleba is that there was no timer, no intermittent threats that would attack, and if the system choked up, it was much easier to reset. The resources you do have access to are generally used to make unique goodies. Similar to Fulgora, the natural liquid on the planet is not water, but rather an ocean of various liquids that can be turned into solid fuel, ice, and the impossible to pronounce fluoroketone that we just started calling ketamine at some point. Many recipes require cold fluoroketone and have a byproduct of hot fluoroketone that needs to then be cooled again. This is a much simpler version of the thermofluid in space exploration, and I imagine for someone that hasn't encountered this, the solution might be a bit tricky, but there's really nothing to it. You can just prioritize the recycled cold fluoroketone before you use newly pumped fluoroketone by prioritizing pumps. Anyway, like the other planets, Aquilo has its own science, but also makes railguns and fusion generators, which are basically much better than nuclear power plants, generating more power and using much less fuel. In fact, at this point, generating power is tricky as solar doesn't work on the planet, and heat generated needs to both make power and heat all of the entities, and bots use 5 times more power, so you need to be very careful with your requester chests. To make anything, it straight up requires imports from Fulgora and Vulcanus, which was a fun change as we now need to import and export from the same planet with one ship. Making the final chip, the Quantum chip, was a really fun challenge too, as there is something like 5 inputs and 4 outputs of various solids and fluids that all need to have adjacent heat pipe in order to work properly. Overall, I really enjoyed Aquilo and thought it was a good decision on the devs' parts to give it less unique recipes favoring puzzle solving and the infrastructure building, as well as the shipbuilding aspects instead. Once all the planets were solved and exporting science, it was time to face up against the final challenge, the Solar System Edge. It is 100,000 miles away, which is over 3 times the normal distance from Navis to a planet. And this is its distance from Aquilo, so the total distance from Navis, which is the best place to start a new ship, is around 160,000 miles away. With even worse solar than Aquilo, this means a ship needs to be self-sufficient for a very long time and also deal with the new threat of huge asteroids. Huge asteroids are incredibly inefficient to kill with anything other than the new railguns, so the new ship now needs turrets, rocket turrets, and railguns to function. You can also throw laser turrets in as well to deal with these small asteroids to save ammo, which I thought was a really cool tech because until this point they were basically useless on a ship as you could only generate power with solar. Also want to note that higher quality asteroid grabbers give extra arms as well as slightly more distance, which I don't know if it necessarily necessarily makes them that much more effective, but you should do it just because they look cooler than anything else in the game. I love the multiple arms going out and grabbing the asteroids. It's one of my favorite things. I want all of them to be legendary, and I don't care if it's effective or not. In any case, I was able to outfit the ship that went to Aquilo in the first place with railguns for my first attempt. It's important to note that each size of asteroid should be killed by only one type of turret: small by laser, medium by gun, large by rockets, and huge by railguns. It seems to be inefficient to over or underkill any of the asteroids, and they have varying resistances that make this specific setup work well. However, researching laser, physical, explosive, and railgun damage does help tip the scale somewhat. If you had physical damage 100, for example, you might be okay using guns to kill large asteroids. Anyway, after a few attempts, I was able to make it all the way to the solar system edge, completing our run at 103 hours. Everyone cheered and rejoiced at the multi-experience of the year, looking back on all this amazing work we had accomplished as a group. There was a lot we struggled with, and if I could give any recommendations to new players, I would say just jump in blind with people you know you like enough to spend hours with every week. It's okay if you make a massive pile of spaghetti and take way longer than more experienced players. The game is about the experience and the journey. I used to look up guides on how to do everything in games, but with this playthrough it was so much more fun, not following any guides or looking up how to do anything. Plenty of things in our factory suboptimal and slow and burning a hole in my computer. Trust me, I get comments about it every single day, but I'd way rather it be our giant pile of factory. Okay, just a few random other things I forgot to add and wanted to throw in here. First off, the map view is similar to space exploration, but improved. I find it really interesting, the back and forth between the space exploration mod and the space age expansion, which I've mentioned before, but just wanted to throw out that the map view was developed in space exploration, which was inspired by the original Factorio aim of going to space, which then inspired the actual Factorio aim of going to space, and I think there's something kind of cool and beautiful about that. The second thing is that cliff explosives and artillery needing to be made on Vulcanus is something I really don't like. In general, making things that were already in the game before harder to attain just feels bad. Artillery was one of the coolest parts of base Factorio. It was a huge power spike and you can really feel it, and needing to ship in every piece of ammo just isn't the same feeling in comparison, in my opinion. I think a good change would be to give Navis the ability to make its own artillery ammo, and I think it's okay that the turrets need to be made on Vulcanus with tungsten. I think that might be kind of an interesting change to think about. I'm not master game designer or anything here. It doesn't need to happen, just my own opinion. The next thing is I wasn't able to play with the music on due to the recordings I was making, but after hearing the new tracks, I like all of them a lot, but I haven't been able to play with them in the background for dozens of hours like I have with the original Factorio soundtrack, so it's up in the air whether they will stand the test of time, and maybe in some solo playthroughs I will find that out. But I am interested in if they are able to do that, because it's a very specific thing for music to be able to be listenable for hours on end in the background. It's not the same thing as having a really good song that you like and can listen to when you're working out, for example. The next thing was that there was a particular issue that popped up in our group playthrough over and over again, causing frustration about communication, and it was the question of where is this thing that we produced. It was almost always followed up by some other passive-aggressive question about the question, as in like, what are you talking about, or which planet, or whatever. You could feel the passive aggressiveness, and it frustrated most people in the factory both ways, and I was one of the biggest offenders because I made a lot of stuff on Navis, so people were asking me that. I can't speak for all groups, so it may be a weird quirk of our group, but I realized that full attention is just not as ubiquitous as it might have been in the past. People are listening to things on other monitors or checking their phones. It's nothing against them, it's just a very natural part of our lives now, and there's also like 100 different things we made on Navis, so memorizing where all of them are made is just not feasible for anybody. So to prevent this frustration, calmly reminding people that they can go into the map view in a planet, press Ctrl F, and type in the name of the object they are looking for, and assemblers making that thing will be highlighted on the map. It makes them really easy to find, and reminding them in a non-passive aggressive way. I think that is a way to get around this potential issue if your group is getting frustrated by this. And there are two important pieces of this puzzle. It is okay to ask where something is. That is not a problem. And the asker has to be okay looking up where the object is on the map if they forget, because it's a really important tool and it's just not feasible for anybody to memorize where everything is made. That's my opinion. And in conclusion, this is one of the best multiplayer experiences I've ever had. There is truly nothing like it. And although I have gripes here and there, it's one of such high quality, and there are so many great ideas and features that went into this that it really sits at the top of the multiplayer games list, I would suggest to a new player. Which is great and all, but where does that leave us? Well, as of the recording of this video, we are 136 hours strong, still pushing toward one final goal. You see, there is a last destination in the post-game called the Shattered Planet, and it is 40 times farther away than Aquilo, which would be hard to get to normally, but we're getting there without the use of fusion or nuclear power. We're getting there with a Dorito. The work started by one of the most inventive members of our group, who was testing the limits of space platform creation, a massive 1,000 tile wide space platform powered only by legendary solar panels called God's Plan. The engineering required to make this work alone is insane, but so far we've been committed to this one last goal: to be the world first to the Shattered Planet with only solar. Thank you for getting all the way through my video. I appreciate it a lot. These videos take a long time to make, so if you want to support me, I appreciate all interactions with this video. Also, a big thank you to all these beautiful people who've decided to throw money at me on Patreon. I dearly appreciate it, and if you find yourself in the want to join them, you can do so at patreon.com/itssaucingtime. And that is all I have, so if you excuse me, I have a Dorito to build.